Hey, I'm glad you're here. Welcome to the Mission Manhood podcast. Today my guest is Chad Zueck, and Chad and I discuss his 6 bulletproof ways to become a better man. I think you'll really get a sense of Chad's heart and his mission and desire to not only help men avoid some of the mistakes that he made, but also to help men thrive and embrace their calling for the mature masculine. If you've been following along and listening, I want you to know how much I appreciate that, and I hope you can take a minute to leave a review or subscribe, and I appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much for joining. Hello and welcome to the Mission Manhood podcast. Today my guest is Chad Zueck. Hello, Chad.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you today?
Today's been a great day, very productive. It's at the end of my workday. Had an early morning run, a lot of productivity in the office today. So I feel like I'm winning, Angela. How about you?
Well, I don't know if I'm that proud of myself, but I'm glad that you had a very, very good productive day. I feel like I'm being very productive right now. So
Awesome.
Sometimes when I've had a rough day, I'm like, you can still redeem this day. It's still redeemable. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of your podcasts I listened to, but before we get into that, I wondered if you could just kind of tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I am a podcast host of a podcast called New Kind of Man. I'm also the podcast host, a brand new podcast host for a podcast called Men of Iron. And you can find both of those wherever you find podcasts. And here, eventually, I'll be phasing out New Kind of Man and just leaning heavily into Men of Iron. And I've joined that team recently. Really looking forward to that connection and just to see what kind of good work that we can produce and just great content. I am married, been married for 27 years, have 2 amazing kids. I will defend my kids at all costs. I think they're awesome. My son's 24. He's married, happily married, been married just about a year. And my daughter is a senior in high school. She's 17 and getting ready to go to college. So exciting days around the Zueck house. And my vocation is I'm a pastor of a church. So that's what I do. And I've worked with men, whether my work with A New Kind of Man has gone on, as far as a platform for a couple of years, but I've worked with men for about 20.
And I think I heard you say that calling or that vocation to work with men is kind of something that you've always had with you, even though you've gone through some different manifestations like pastor, but the men's work was always on your heart.
Yeah, absolutely. It is near and dear to my heart. It's one of those things. I'm a strong believer in the fact that, when you've had healing in your life, as that healing comes around full circle, that you find an avenue of service. More than likely, a lot of guys do this, a lot of men and women both. But after there's healing and you've gone through that process of healing, that you want to help other people receive the healing that you did. And it's been an amazing ride so far. And just the work for near about 20 years or so of just being able to work with guys and teenagers as well from time to time, and to help them maybe to avoid some of the problems and some of the pitfalls that I fell into, and allow them to know that, hey, there's a better way. And if they would allow me, I'll be their guide.
Yeah, that's really awesome. That kind of goes to more of a mentor, someone who's invested. Have you always lived in Georgia?
No, actually, I grew up in Illinois. My wife and I were high school sweethearts growing up in Illinois. Then I went and did 4 years in the Navy, and we lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and actually in Orange Park, a suburb of Jacksonville. After that, moved back to Illinois, got my undergrad, and then went to working on airplanes, actually. Worked on corporate jets for several years. Did that for a while, and then since the calling to go into vocational ministry, and I've been doing that for 15 years, 5 of it in Florida, and then 10 here.
So the Men of Iron thing, that was a surprise to me to hear you say you were kind of phasing out your podcast.
Yeah, I'll spare you the full backstory of that, but I really sensed that I needed somebody else to kind of partner with me. I'm a visionary. That's just who I am. To use spiritual language, I'm very apostolic is the terminology that goes with that. So I'm very much forward thinking and kind of forward leaning, looking for things to do, new ventures, new activities. But the problem is, to use a football analogy, I can outpump my coverage really easily. And I can get really invested in a bunch of things and then get discouraged and never see anything into fulfillment. So I really sensed that if I was going to continue the work and managing the website, and if I was going to advance into coaching more, and if I was going to do a podcast, and I'm actually probably 15, 20% into writing a book. There's a lot of ventures that I was into. I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do all of those things well. So I started truthfully seeking God and saying, okay, what does this look like? I read an incredible book, a pivotal book for me called Rocket Fuel, where it talks about vision, the combination of somebody being a visionary and an integrator. And I realized clearly that I was the visionary, and that if I operated in the integrator role, that it was actually taking energy from me instead of adding life. The visionary piece adds life, where the other was taking away. And then really out of the blue, I started to connect with the guys at Men of Iron. They reached out to me. They'd heard the podcast, seen what I was doing on Instagram, and saw the website. And then we, for the last few months, have been talking, and they had downsized their podcast. And then their vision is very much in alignment with mine, so much so I joined their team, officially joined their team this week. And so it's just been a really cool thing. And now they have the full integration piece ready. It's moving, great website, all the other, behind the scenes stuff that nobody else sees that a work like this needs to carry a platform and move forward. It was really kind of exactly what I needed. And I believe that I was exactly what they needed. So it was an opportunity that we mutually couldn't pass up.
Another podcast guest I had told me that his mentor said, you have to start walking, just start walking, and you'll really be surprised at how it turns out. Sometimes you might be surprised to realize that you're joining with these other guys, but it all makes sense at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
maybe that's
absolutely
not what you were thinking when you started off.
Yeah, when I started, it's interesting because we were talking before we started recording about me being a perfectionist, and that was one of the challenges. For me, I could do a lot of work with men, ground level, street level, right where I am, and I still do mentor men here and there, and leadership development here and there. I still continue all of that, but there was a piece of that I was a little bit reluctant to actually go public with the website and a podcast. And it took a lot of leaning and kind of prodding. And then my wife ultimately challenging me and just saying, hey, this is something you need to do, and don't shy away from it. You have a lot to add. And so I just started, to use the language you just talked about from your previous podcast guest. I just started walking. Yeah. I started just kind of like doing a little bit and little bit and little bit. And you can't move a parked car, as they say, and a parked car doesn't change directions. So I've just kind of been sensitive to whoever the guests would come on my show or other podcasts that I've been on. And I'm a sponge. I'm an avid reader. So for me, just trying to grow and also not kind of shrink back from opportunities, including opportunities like this to be on the great podcast.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you're here. I have kind of a really narrow lane being a woman, I think, in this space. And I guess it's just three parts. And one is the foundational wounds or the foundational healing that people need to do. Mm-hmm. And the next step would be the divine dance, or that integration of the masculine and feminine. And the third is the 4 archetypes of mature masculinity. And I feel like that happens on a micro, that king, warrior, magician, and lover. And then it also happens in macro. And before we moved on, I wanted to point that out. I think in your own heart, you kind of have to get those characteristics balanced, like the vision of the king and the discipline and the knowledge of the magician or the compassion of the lover. But then when you're building your tribe, it's almost like you want, I know what I'm gifted in or what I kind of major in. And then I want other people that major in other things to build this community. I think it's really cool that that's kind of what's happening.
Yeah. I really like that. And, the archetypes are interesting. I'm not super deep in those.
Yeah.
I really appreciate those actually. And when I look at those, of course, what I know is the king is ultimately the fulfillment of the other ones, in completion or maturity. And for me, when I look at all those aspects, that's the reason why I lean heavily into like the life of Jesus, because out of all human beings who've ever walked the earth, I think Jesus was, in my opinion anyway, he was the prototype. He is the source. He's the one that we should look to, because again, in my estimation, he's the fulfillment of all those things. So we can look at a bunch of different men, a bunch of different time periods, and kind of see how the masculine archetypes, they render themselves out with this particular person or this particular person. But I think only in Jesus do we see the fulfillment or the full maturity on display.
And I know that you're a pastor and a Christian, but
Mhm.
I think anyone could look at the life of Christ and really see a model of, as you said, these four different archetypes. He was just the perfect example of that. Once you recognize that ideal and that model, and this is very prominent in Christianity too, is making those proper sacrifices to become that, and to become something bigger than yourself. I wanted to talk about your talk that I heard, the 6 bulletproof ways to become a better man.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those was the submission or the surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And I think making those sacrifices to become more than who you could just be on your own is what leads to a life of meaning.
Absolutely. I think that if we even look at this, kind of step back out of the Bible, or just in that space, I think if we're just to be honest and look at the people, men and women throughout history, who we celebrate are those who've sacrificed the most.
Yes.
I mean, those are the type of people who I think are heroic in nature. The beauty of all of this is, and really the 6 bulletproof ways to become a better man, it starts with source, knowing who God is, and then consequently seeing ourselves in light of him. Then also submitting to that source, realizing that source is perfect and holy and right and true, and that there's a part of us that's fallen, that is incomplete. And then what God offers is sonship. That's identity. That's true identity. That's identity rooted not in accomplishments, but just in personhood, not in performance, but just in who we are. And then strength in the alignment of these things is important to me, because the strength comes after your source. That way we can kind of lean into creative intent. What was the creator's intent when he made us male and female? And then also submitting to that source that's higher and greater than ours. We have an identity intact, or in tow with us, and then we know actually the strength that we have to offer, and then we gain support. And then the last one that you made reference to is serving. And the order of that is vital, because if we just start out, we just try and white knuckle life to say, well, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to serve. If our heart's not right, ultimately, we're just going to try and bend that back to where we benefit, to where we try and create our own heroic model by only serving ourselves.
I think that you're right about that. And I oftentimes think about this story in the Bible about the Tower of Babel. And I feel like when we try to do something in our own strength, we are trying to be like God without actually paying that price or making that sacrifice we're just doing it out of our own ego, maybe.
The ego is a tricky thing, because there's a part of it that's healthy, and then it obviously can get twisted, in my opinion, and get really unhealthy. But I think the faulty ego, false self, shadow, the shadow work, using archetypal language, I think all of that kind of, again, in my belief system, is that needs to be handed over to the source. That needs to be handed over to Christ. Therefore, all that faulty stuff, so he can remake us into the new people that he's trying to have us to become. And therefore we can live in submission, that we can use our strength to actually help support other people. And also part of the support piece that I just kind of glossed over earlier is the fact that it takes a community. It isn't just a solo effort. For me to become the person who I'm supposed to become, I can't do that siloed off from the rest of the world. I need my wife's help. I need my kids' help. I need my friends' help. I need other acquaintances, people close to me, people far away from me. And it is my job to learn what I'm supposed to learn, so I can continually shed that that faulty ego shadow, if you will, to live in the fullness of who God is making me to be and who he wants me to be.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about the healthy ego. I think the ego is not a bad thing. And in fact, my last episode was on that very subject. It's not a bad thing, but just like your body, your mind, your ego needs to be surrendered to that vision or to God or something greater than yourself, or else it tends to become self-serving, and then you're not doing what you were put here to do. I was raised in the church, and so I feel like I know exactly what you're talking about. And I also practice internal family systems therapy, which to me is sort of I know this probably doesn't make sense, but it's kind of a secular way of saying kind of the same thing. They teach that you have a true self, and then you have these parts, that the whole idea is to be true to yourself and to start to manage your parts. But just allowing people to examine their wounds. And I think you talked a lot about that earlier in your talk when you were talking about childhood. One thing that you mentioned was your wife, just even in this latest endeavor, where she came to you and said, look, you're gifted. You need to expand. Don't be afraid to step out. I just love that. And I think that is part of that humility piece that you talked about. Someone that you referenced said that humility is the virtue that everything else hinges on.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, humility basically puts us at a place where we can learn, where we can grow, where we can serve, where we can lean in to make the world a better place instead of just trying to make us look better to the world. And again, the pathway, as I see it, is to be heroic. It is to be one of service. But unless you have humility, and Andrew Murray is the person who was quoted, okay. And that's what he said. He said, humility is the virtue that every other virtue hangs. In other words, I'm not going to love my wife well if I'm not humble, because I'll only be about what I can get from her, or my kids, or my friends. I mean, we all know and maybe have had caustic friends, right? So it's like some of the things that make friendships really caustic and just abrasive, and we just want to run away from these people, is you see that they're out for themselves. They're not there to help you. This isn't like some mutual uplifting kind of thing. It's just, they're like a mosquito looking for a host. What do we do with mosquitoes? We swat them and flick them away, right? If they land on us. So it's kind of the same thing. The humility side of it that's also very tricky, because humility comes at a lot of times humility comes at a steep price. A lot of times we have to have a cataclysmic fall, and we have to get to the end of ourselves. Sometimes it's after a divorce. Sometimes it's after our kids have left the house and they don't even want to be in the same room with us, or you lost a job, or somebody's had some abuse, whether they're growing up, or there could be a multitude of different things. But I think ultimately what we need to learn from those after we get healing from the trauma, I'm not dismissing the healing that needs to take place. And there's varying different healings that are required for the varying traumas, of course. Some more deeper than others. But I think we need to learn humility. And if we don't learn humility, we're not going to be lovable, and we're not going to be able to love, and we're not going to be able to serve.
I agree with that. It's one thing that I think makes me feel, the way I look at it is, if we were in an emergency situation, when I feel like someone has humility, I want to get in their line. I want to follow them. Mm-hmm. It actually makes people want to surrender to you, because you know that they're surrendered to something higher.
Right.
You mentioned something in your talk, the Peter Pan-hearted men with Rambo aggression.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that a lot. Culturally, I see it in Christian culture. I see it, honestly, I see it in the generations coming up, just speaking generally. Not all men in every situation is this way. Every man has agency. They have power. It's God-given power for them to do and to work and to achieve and, to have dominion, to the creation mandate is of us to be able to have this ability to do things and to create and to rule and to reign as kings and queens on earth. But with that responsibility, unless it is surrendered, unless we know the source, unless all the things that I talked about earlier, in my estimation, unless we get that order right, we'll have all of this aggression, but yet we live in such a passive aggressive culture to where we have this anger, resentment toward people. You see this politically, you see this spiritually, you see this socially. It's just this underlying hatred and vitriol toward other people, but they don't have the guts to actually go forward to make anything right. So instead, they just go home and they bring all that vengeance out on their wife and their kids. It's a twisting of that aggression that I think is a God-given trait. It's a wonderful thing. And again, it needs to be surrendered. We need to submit to the source. I get fired up about it because it cuts really against the core of me as a man, because I think a man should stand up and own his space and to be able to do the things that are required of him.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I think that was such an interesting, I've thought about the Peter Pan movie a lot. You know, you had Peter Pan, who was kind of the boy man. He hadn't really done the work. He hadn't really killed the dragon, so to speak, and really crossed over, but he had really good intentions and he was having fun. And then you had Sneed and Captain Hook. And so it's like his options, his men that he was seeing were a really good guy that just was completely taken advantage of, or somebody who was just completely unaccountable to anyone, who was just making everybody's life miserable.
Yeah. What's so subversive about that too, about the Peter Pan, is it looks very nice on the outside.
Yeah.
But there's this seething resentment on the inside that few people actually get to see. And I think that this corresponds to with, which I'm sure that you talk at length about this, the suppression of emotions within men particularly, and not knowing how to process any emotion. So really the emotion that comes out most of the time with men is anger. If they don't know how to process emotion, it's like, well, the one that they're wired for is the one connected to aggression is anger, So I think it's that kind of mentality that I see, and I can't help but see, but also fires me up to get in the trenches and stay in the trenches and keep doing this work.
Yeah. Going back to the analogy of Peter Pan, I mean, there were all kind of boys there. Some of them were really sad about their mother. Some of them were sort of angry about their childhood. Mm-hmm. And they had all different kind of wounds, but they all needed to do that inner work, which I feel like is represented in your first 3 steps. That source and the submit and that sonship. Mm-hmm. You have to get to that place where it's almost like you become your own parent. You learn to have compassion on yourself. Mm-hmm. And for men, it's complicated when their relationship with their mother is messed up, but it's also complicated when their relationship with their father is messed up, and for different reasons. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe you touched on this a little bit in your talk, but if you don't go and do that foundational work, it really hinders you from being able to have healthy relationships with your wife or your children.
Yeah. You mentioned foundation and really the image. A lot of times I think in imagery and tell stories around it. But several years ago, I had the opportunity when I was in the Navy to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Mm-hmm. And while it's a beautiful structure, the only reason we've even heard of that structure, which ultimately it's not that impressive. It's beautiful, but it's not that big. It's not that impressive if you actually mm-hmm. see it. But the reason why we even know about that is because of the faulty foundation around it. They built upon a bad foundation, and then as it started to give way, it's like then they started to counterbalance. Now they're trying to keep it from falling, and they have been for a long time. But that just, that's a mental picture of, okay, if you can have the coolest thing, and yet if the foundation is off, it's going to crumble. It may look right for a while, but eventually that foundation will expose its weakness and there will be a fall.
And I think too, if you don't learn to love yourself, and I think that this is biblical too, because I think about the story about Jesus going after the one sheep. He left the 99 to go after the one. And to me, I think about that as someone who goes down deep and allows themselves to see their own wounds and allows that healing. But you said something about men try to stay outside of themselves. It's almost like, I don't know if you meant that they're kind of afraid to go inward and to examine that.
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to, that because it is, it's one of those things when somebody does the deep work and you venture into that place inside of ourselves where you really seek healing, they're going to be surprised in what they see. And what they're going to see is they're going to see some ugly. And it can be very intimidating. So I think we just have to be true to the story on that too. I think that we need to create safe places within a brotherhood for them to kind of work through that, maybe with somebody else who's gone through that journey, to kind of cheer him on. And that's where the support piece comes in. It's gaining the support of other people to cheer us on that journey, because it is a long and arduous road. It's difficult. When you start doing that work, or shadow work, as some in the field of psychology would call it, or just the work of the false self. Like if you do that, it is a daunting work. And you need to know that, hey, if I'm going to go through this, we need to know that, hey, somebody else is going to go through it with us, because you don't go through that process alone. But also we want to see it come to fulfillment. Men don't want to do things unless they know they can succeed.
Yeah.
So I think as soon as they look at that long and arduous road, if they don't have the hope that, hey, I can actually get through this and come out as a better person, they're going to avoid it. I kind of live with this belief that ultimately human beings will find the path of least resistance, especially when it comes to deep work like that, because it's so foreign to much of our culture to actually have those kinds of conversations. We're very much a microwave culture. If I can get it right now and just cook this thing and it's done, if I have to put it in the crock pot and I have to sit and watch the thing for 12 hours or 12 years, count me out.
Yeah.
So I think the support piece is valuable to help men on that journey.
Before we move on from doing that inner work, sometimes what you aren't willing to do for yourself, you'll do for your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you mentioned this in your talk. Maybe it was part 2, but you talked about how we tend to project those unhealed things out onto others. And what I tell people is, if you don't get that right, if you don't start to treat yourself like someone you care about, if you don't start to treat yourself with compassion, that's going to be projected out. You're going to treat your actual children just like you treat your inner child.
Mm-hmm.
And if your inner critic is very mean to your inner child, if you don't get that right, you will project that out onto the people you love and hurt them. It's such a great investment in the future to do that work for yourself, I believe.
Yeah, I totally agree. You talk about inner critic, and one of the tools that's been super helpful for myself and my leadership and friendships and my marriage and raising kids is the Enneagram. And I'm an Enneagram 1. And if you know the Enneagram, as soon as I said perfectionist earlier, you probably leaned into that. In one of the characteristics of an Enneagram 1 is the inner critic.
Uh-huh.
That is the defining characteristic of that particular personality type. Yeah. That's different than the others. Is just that inner critic. It could get better. It should be better. You should be better. Everything could be better. I think you were alluding to a quote that I used from Richard Rohr. What pain doesn't get transformed, it gets transferred.
Yes.
And it's been said a few different ways. I think Rollheiser said that too, and it probably goes back even before those guys. But yeah, so you talk about the inner critic. So I realized this as soon as I started to come to terms with Enneagram, that language and what it looks like and the study of it. Man, I'll tell you, that was a scary thing. And that wasn't that long ago. It's only a couple of years ago. But that was a pretty scary thing, because I realized, wow, I've been raising my kids with that same inner critic thing. And it just so happens that my daughter is also an Enneagram 1. So it's been really helpful for me to connect with her. She and I have a deep and rich relationship, and of which I'm very thankful. A lot of times that I get her and she gets me, different than a lot of other people do, because we see the world in a similar way.
Yeah.
But my son, it was different. He, not just the dad son role, but also I think that me using that faulty inner critic and then passing that on, that I didn't know what I was doing. So then I was just kind of like overly critical to him. And we have a deep and rich relationship now too, but it was hard.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was my fault because I didn't know what I was doing. And I was basically passing off my shadow side onto him.
Yeah. That's a really powerful way to say it. You were passing off your shadow side to him. And I've often thought that verse in the Bible that says, the sins of the father will be visited on the children.
Yes.
It's such a psychological thing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the way you're ingrained to do things a certain way and you do it that certain way and you're not open to healing or to making those sacrifices, then your kids pick that up and then they pass it on and everybody just keeps going on unhealed.
I've been in the people business. That's what I call ministries. It's just the people business. I've been in the people business for a long time. And I echo every part of that. I've just seen these generational issues, generation to generation to generation, and thought patterns and practices and bad health patterns. I mean, it's just psychological issues, relational issues, commitment issues, whatever the case may be. I was just seeing that passed on. When you're talking, Angela, I was reminded of a quote that it may be Pete Scazzaro who said it, but he said something to the effect of talking about when people commit their life to God, to Christ, that they say, you may have Jesus in your heart, but you have grandpa in your bones.
Mm.
And that has been like one of those haunting quotes since I heard it, because I'm like, whoa. And that really speaks into what we're talking about. That's the practices, the beliefs, the negativity or positivity, whatever it was, that whoever it is that we are a product of our upbringing, positively or negatively, because grandpa's in our bones.
Wow, that's a powerful quote.
Yeah. And then if you think even, and I can't really speak at length about this, so I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface and I'm going to back away slowly because I can't talk at depth about this. But even what I know about epigenetics, I believe that's what that terminology is, that you can actually go into somebody's DNA strand now and you can see trauma within, this is what I've heard and done a little bit of study on, not a lot. But you can actually go into DNA strands now and see the trauma. And you can also see when that trauma has had a ripple effect generationally.
Wow.
Ultimately, to me, it validates what we already know to be true, whether behaviorally, spiritually, but also we see this even clinically.
Yeah.
And physiologically.
That Jesus in your heart and grandpa in your bones. I mentioned internal family systems earlier, and the goal is kind of to identify that self. Or like Richard Rohr says, Christ consciousness. To me, it's very, very similar concept. And then you're managing the parts. And I had a really wise man say to me one time, Angela, of the body, mind, and spirit, only two need to be redeemed. And that hit me really hard. And it's like, that's what the discipline is for. I discipline my mind and I discipline my body so that my true self or Christ consciousness can shine. And then I can be surrendered to that and sacrifice to that. I don't know if that kind of goes along with what you're saying, but it gives you hope because there's an override for that DNA.
Oh, absolutely. And that's really the hope. That's really the hope of the gospel and Christian theology. Like there is that ability to this story, it's not, the ending to that story has not been written. So we can change, and not just a superficial change. I mean, we can all superficially change. I can fast for 40 days and drop 20 pounds,
Right.
and go on. But it's superficial because eventually, if it's not deep enough in me, I'm going to bounce right back. I'm going to eat. I'm going to get right back in my health, whatever condition of health that I normally kind of operate in. And then a year from now, I'm going to be the exact same person. That's all superficial. And the hope of the gospel and Christian theology is that the change happens on the inside to the outside. So the internal motivators within us change us with the renewal of the mind, because you have to have the mind active as well. And then you discipline the body to live in conjunction with the soul and spirit while renewing the mind. So it takes in all aspects for us to truly change. And we can change. If I was the same guy that I was 25 years ago, Angela, I would be the very last person you would want to talk to about any of these things at
Yeah.
all. Except if you're going to do like a case study for what not to do, then I'm your guy. Like I would have nailed that. But for me, I would have nothing to add if there wasn't an ability to change. And I attribute the change that has happened in my life, first and foremost, to God's work in my life, and then secondarily to how well I've submitted to Him, and then consequently, He's given me the grace to be able to change through this journey, and it is a journey.
Yeah. You know what I really appreciated about your talk too is right after your sort of foundational healing stuff, which is exactly what I say, is you went right into the Genesis account of, the creation of mankind and then the difference sort of between the masculine and feminine.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things we could have 2 or 3 podcasts on, but
Sure. Yeah.
I was thinking about this and I wanted to just see what you thought about it, because to me, this is a hard thing to talk to men about, is embracing the feminine, because people have different ideas about what that means. I thought, since you have a male child and a female child, I was going to test this on you, but I think in our, yeah, you can tell me what you think, be honest. But I think as a society, we naturally teach our girls to embrace the masculine. And the reason we do that is so they won't be taken advantage of. We teach our girls to be queens with a vision, and we teach them to be disciplined, and we teach them to increase their knowledge. We teach them to change a tire, because you don't want them to always have to do that for themselves. But if they're on the side of the road in the middle of the night, you want your daughter to be empowered. Mm-hmm. And so even if your daughter's highest goal in her life is to get married and have kids and be that traditional feminine woman, she also is equipped to do other things. And I don't think we do as great of a job with that with our boys, teaching our boys to balance themselves out in that way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what I would love to see happen is male initiations. I would love to see that full scale. I think there's a lot of this that goes into maybe even back to the Industrial Revolution, to where taking men out of the home, where the men used to be the educator and now they're not the educator, and now they've kind of passed that off. Back then, 1800s timeframe, we started to make this shift toward defaulting and then basically passing off that mantle of responsibility of male initiation from our boys that used to happen just out cutting wood. It was the lessons of the farm. It was lessons of life. It was hunting. It was gathering. It was, take care of your sister. And now I think that we're so individually driven, and radically so, that I think who's suffering the most culturally is boys. And when boys suffer, women and children also suffer. We're 3 or 4 generations deep of uninitiated men who don't know how to initiate their boys. And everything that you talked about as far as development of the feminine, I've said all of those things to my daughter. I want her to be self-sufficient, but I don't want her to be self-sufficient to where, she's a radical feminist who says, I'll never need a man. To me, that's an unhealthy version of the feminine. Just as we don't want to create a stigma on the other side where we have unhealthy masculinity. I don't know who said it originally. It may have been Leanne Payne, but in talking about the polarity of the masculine and feminine. Yeah. And that give and take in the initiation of the masculine and then the receiving of the feminine. And this is not just talking about reproduction, but it's talking about life. It's just talking about just engagement, how we're supposed to operate in the world. And, that is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I would love to see little boys initiated so they get a better start than I did. Yeah.
One thing that you mentioned in your talk it was from a book that a woman wrote. When men are healed, the healing of women follow. Mm-hmm. That's really kind of why I'm in this space, is that dawned on me. Like when you are at the honky tonk and the guy comes over and holds out his hand for the dance. Will you 2-step with me? That's how it is in life. The man rises up and offers his life to her, and then she can follow. To me, it starts there. And as men rise up And as you said, understand their source, understand humility and submission and sonship. They take ownership of that. Then people naturally just surrender to them and want to follow them.
Yeah, I agree with every bit of that. And that was Leanne Payne, and the book was called Crisis of Masculinity. And I was really surprised when I read the book and I ran across that quote. I was like, wow, I would totally expect a guy to write this. And then when she wrote it, it was to me a really eye-opening book and understanding. And I've seen it in my own life, just the way that my marriage particularly has unfolded is I got the healing first. And through that, it's like, and I had years of like learning myself and trying to figure out, man, what in the world, why do I do what I do? And I can see that my wife, she has a strong personality. I love her for it. She's different than me. I mean, you talk about the polarity. I mean, we're opposites, and yet we are just this beautiful mix. We really are. And so with all that, it's like I've seen this in real life, and I've also seen the other side of it. I've also seen the times where I have shrunk back from my responsibility, and I've also seen her wither in the midst of it. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to say that I've arrived, that I just automatically get it right now all the time. I don't. It's a work. It's a strive for me to do the right thing. It does take effort. It takes intentionality. What I tell men that I've worked with in the past, and they're trying to think, okay, well, I just don't know what to do at home. I said, just imagine you're clocking in for second shift at home. So just to visualize, before you walk through that door, there's going to be work that's required of you. It's going to stretch you. It's going to push you. You may not get a pat on the back. It's going to require you to initiate more than just be on the receiving end. To imagine yourself clocking in for second shift. But it just so happens that second shift is the real basis for your life. So just the richness of those relationships.
Yeah. I would recommend for anyone to check out your episode. It's 2 episodes, actually, the 6 Bulletproof Ways to Become a Better Man. There was so much in that. One thing that I think is really interesting about your 6, source, submit, sonship, strength, support, and serve. For the first 3, the source, the submit, and the sonship, I feel like that's where my work kind of stops, and that's kind of the inner. And then as people get that inner healing and they're ready to sort of launch out, like that initiation you're talking about, that's when they're really growing in that strength and growing in knowledge and getting mentors and having support from the tribe and other men to show them how to be men. Also just rising up and finding your place in the world. Where am I going to give back? Where am I going to give my life for life?
I think that was a keen takeaway from that, and seeing that your work rests on the first 3 pieces. And it's important for you, even moving forward, that you recognize that about your own work.
We didn't talk about the female archetypes, but that wisdom or Sophia or the great mother, sometimes a consult with that to just try to help you figure out maybe where you got stuck. And it might have been a long time ago, in the time where, you were with your mother. Anyway, I think everybody working together and doing their little part, hopefully we can make a difference.
Yeah, I believe we can. I'm glad you have this podcast and you're doing the work that you do. You probably feel a little bit like an underdog, just being a woman in this space trying to help men. But I think that your voice is valuable, and your experience and education is valuable also. So keep doing what you do. I think you're doing a great work, and we're all better for it.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And I look forward to see what's going to come with your new venture. And I think that's really exciting.
Yep. I'm looking forward to it, and just to see what that looks like. We have, again, all sorts of creative outlets that we're talking about, dreaming about, and I think the future is bright for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you let people know where they can reach you or how they can contact you?
Yeah. You can reach me on Instagram at A New Kind of Man is my handle on Instagram. And also they can go to my website, beanewman.com. You can find the New Kind of Man podcast on all of the usual podcast players. And you can also find my new podcast, Men of Iron podcast. You can find that on all your podcast players as well. And you will get a healthy dose of who I am and what I'm about and the different things that I'll be up to in the future.
Has the first episode of the new podcast, Men of Iron, happened yet?
Yeah, it dropped yesterday.
Okay, great. So we can check that out. All right. Thank you, Chad.
You're welcome. Thank you.